and what it might be. And as I said, I'm going to begin from the perspective of my own discipline, which is that of media or communication studies. I prefer media studies because generally in Canada we do not do things like interpersonal communication or forms of communication studies that are not primarily media focused. Those are more common, for example, in the United States. Organizational communications, which is generally not media focused either, is quite popular in Francophone universities in Canada, but not much in the Anglophone tradition. In Anglophone Canada, communication studies tends to mean media studies, and so that's the term I feel most comfortable with. Now, if you've been involved for any length of time in communications or media studies in the English-speaking world, you'll probably have encountered the long-standing debate between what are on the one hand called political economy approaches, on the other, those approaches designated as cultural studies. Has anybody here heard of this debate? Okay. The debate first emerged in the 1980s when it involved figures like Lawrence Grossberg and Nicholas Garnham. There was a famous instantiation of that debate in the journal Media, Culture and Society. Much of the time, this debate between a political economy of culture and media and a cultural studies of media and culture has been an unproductive one in which people simply talk past each other. As Lawrence Grossberg expressed it in the title of one of his own contributions to this debate, this is his title, "Is Anyone Else Bored with This Debate?" Years later, in 2006, in the pages of the American journal Cultural Critique, someone published an article with the title, "Why We Shouldn't Be Bored with the Political Economy versus Cultural Studies Debate." But by the time you'd finished reading that article, you were back to being bored with it. Because the article perpetuated the boredom much more than it resolved it. So put crudely, the debate is the familiar one between those who feel that cultural studies find their political effectivity in the discursive work they do with ideas and representations. I think I have a PowerPoint for that, which would be good. Yeah. Between, on the one hand, those who feel that cultural texts find their political effectivity in the discursive work they do with ideas and representations. This, I think, is how we can define cultural studies. And those who see cultural texts primarily as outputs or tokens in structures of commerce and power that are the real scene of politics. This is traditionally the implicit and sometimes explicit claim of a political economy of culture. Now, I've often felt that this debate didn't speak to me, or that neither side in this debate spoke fully to me, or that identified wholeheartedly with it. And that's not just because I tend to veer wildly between the two sides. Sometimes I do very straight economic studies of the music industry. Other times I'm analyzing narrative structures in a disco song of the mid-1970s. I've always found myself frustrated by the willfully self-imposed limitations of those who do political economies of culture, their absolute disinterest in how structures of economic and institutional power embed themselves in cultural forms and styles. But I'm just as kind of irritated by a stereotypical kind of cultural studies work that in analyzing a cultural artifact arrives at what are very often predictable claims about its complicity with structures of power, and in particular the capacity of certain audiences to resist that complicity. Megan Morris spoke almost 2 decades ago about the banality of a certain kind of cultural studies that found resistance everywhere, and you'll be familiar with that diagnosis of the situation. The problem is not of finding resistance, which of course is what cultural studies does crucially and regularly. It's that a certain kind of cultural studies always located the moment of resistance in the act of consumption or reception, and not elsewhere in the world or not elsewhere in the field of culture. Now, a common approach on the part of those who are bored with the debate between these two things is to say that we need approaches which bring them together, which move between the different levels. But this almost never happens. One reason is simply that very few scholars possess the expertise to do both. The expertise that would allow you to understand industrial structures, intellectual property, regimes of policy, and so on, as well as be pretty good at doing ethnographies of audiences or analyses of text. Those who study institutions and industries often have difficulty seeing the cultural artifact as anything more than a black box spit out by institutional and industrial processes, which are what interest them most. Those who do cultural studies often have difficulty leaving behind their conviction that cultural studies play themselves out most forcefully at the moment of reception, consumption, or interpretation. Now, the last thing I want to do is essentialize the Canadian or the English-Canadian mind. And I don't want to suggest that all cultural studies in Canada express sort of some intrinsic social order and forms of governments or sensibility that we have here. But I want to argue that in Canada, and indeed in most countries of the world that are not dominant producers of culture or of cultural meaning, there is often an intuitive understanding of culture that challenges the kinds of cultural studies that have developed most strikingly in the United States. And the United States will sound like my bête noire here. In a way, it stands for the United States and the UK and France and other countries where there's a certain taken-for-grantedness about the state of culture, an abstraction of processes of production and distribution and so on, that in Canada we always understand almost inescapably as complex. There is a greater sense of any cultural artifact as produced within relations that are unequal in somewhere like Canada, I would argue, as of any cultural artifact as involving some version of adaptation or translation, of any cultural artifact as enabled and constrained by systems of governance and patterns of trade. If you're a 12-year-old boy collecting comics or even sort of buying fashion and notice, the price differentials between the United States, there's a built-in kind of understanding of systems of circulation that transcend the nation, that is built into, I think, the common sense knowledge of the Canadian consumer and participant in culture. So to circumscribe the cultural artifact, the television show and so on, to make it a terrain of ideological struggle, but to take its very existence for granted, I think is typical of cultural studies work produced in dominant cultural producing countries like the US or the UK. In countries that I know fairly well, like Canada, Mexico, and Brazil, and in innumerable other places around the globe, this taken for grantedness is generally not there. Now, I want to pursue this through a series of claims that start with this debate between political economy and cultural studies, and then sort of build back up the argument that I just presented in sort of summary right now. So, here's the first claim. This is that without hardly anyone ever admitting it, the debate between a political economy and a cultural studies has often settled into a debate between those who are interested in the production or distribution of cultural artifacts and those interested in their reception or consumption. In the history of political economy, what you mostly study is how things get made and distributed. In the history of cultural studies, most of the key works have been about reception and consumption. And so there's an implicit division of labor, except that the methods, the points of departure are so different that production is studied in a way that has no applicability, typically, to the study of reception. And what has often happened, let's say in the last 30 years that we can point to the existence of cultural studies and its relationship to political economy, is that the division of labor has often settled in a way that leaves cultural studies finding exceptions or resistance in consumption to challenge the monolithic claims made by those who study production distribution, who usually are political economists, usually Marxist political economists. So a typical case would be political economists demonstrating the fact that NBC is owned by, is it still owned by, who is it owned, General Electric? No, who knows anymore? And their connection to the armament industries, and showing, for example, how NBC is part of the industrial military war complex. Very noble, important work. Cultural studies scholars will then arrive to show that nevertheless, many of the programs, the network television programs shown on NBC, allow for complex and resistant forms of consumption. In other words, particularly in its earliest manifestations, cultural studies offered itself constantly as a kind of corrective to political economy, a but, ... What you described may be true, but at the end point of the whole process, at the moment at which the consumer sits confronted with a television program, something else goes on that perhaps unravels that. In cultural studies, then, textual complexity came to be offered as the antidote to structural simplicity. And what I think in part this is that it's a conflict of scholarly taste between the humanities and the social scientists. The humanities, who are by definition invested in the idea that texts are complex, are going to find the kind of Marxist political economy simplistic. These people wouldn't know a text if it ran over them on the street. Similarly, political economists, and this has played itself out in Canadian debates, will see cultural studies scholars as offering alibis for things which for them are the products of malevolent industrial corporations. Okay, my argument is this. Cultural studies' emphasis on consumption or reception as determining moments in the life of social artifacts always seems to me to come easiest to those who inhabit cultures, let's say the US, where the production of cultural artifacts is naturalized and abstracted. And what I mean by this is that in so much US-based media studies, how things get made is ascribed to kind of general abstracted forces like capitalism or public life, if we're speaking more generally about certain kinds of speech. Once the cultural object has arrived, once it has arrived at what I call its encounter with the citizen consumer, that's when cultural studies of that sort goes to work. And there's not a lot of interest in processes that precede this. I find this very much in US-based work on popular music, where there's the evil music industry, and then there's all the creative, oppositional, resistant, interesting things that consumers do with it. But the industry itself is abstracted, is rendered monolithic, because they don't have to say the US industry, it's just the industry, and of course it's implied that it's US. And this is partly why what I've been feeling in the last year or so is that cultural studies needs, I would say two things. One is that cultural studies needs lots more production studies, and B, that everybody I know in Canada who's interesting, including most of you here, seems to be doing that, looking at how culture is made, because that getting made is not an obvious or natural thing. So, a focus on cultural production has always seemed most pertinent to the study of what might loosely be called minoritarian cultural forms, like those produced by literary or musical avant-gardes. You have very interesting work on cultural production about these kinds of things, because the struggle to produce will normally seem more socially complex than the often fleeting and socially marginal moments in which these forms are consumed. But I would also argue that a similar complexity marks cultural production in secondary national cultures like those of Quebec or English Canada, where the making of culture usually involves multi-leveled systems of public and private support, literal and figurative acts of cultural translation, and the inescapable sense that each artifact embodies a particular relationship between here and a variety of elsewheres. Once you've come to see the book, the CD, back when we had CD, well, we still have CDs, but the film as marked by all of these things, then it can no longer be a black box. It has to be opened up, and that opening up requires a textual analysis that can open up onto a political economic analysis, but you can't, at that point, I think, separate the two. Here's a hypothesis that I came up with on the train after one glass of wine, so I think it's still kind of, well, they don't know if you've been on the train recently, but now the wine comes in those cardboard juice things. It's like, maybe I'm a snob, but that doesn't seem, okay. So, my hypothesis is that US-style cultural studies responds to the monolithic vision offered by political economy by finding conflict, complexity, and resistance in the text itself and in the variety of interpretations or uses that the text permits. If there's no struggle at the level of production, and there's little interest in that usually, we will find it in consumption. Whereas Canadian cultural studies at its best, in my view, responds to the monolithic view offered by US cultural studies, and it's not so much monolithical as just predictable, that texts are perennial sites of resistance and counter-reading through an attentiveness to production as the phase in which conflict and contradiction play themselves out most forcefully and interestingly. The making of culture in Canada is complex and contradictory because it involves the assemblage of culture out of materials from different places under the pressure of competing government, identitarian pressures, individual ambitions, and so on. So Canadian cultural studies, to put this very crudely, at its very best, finds in the very making of culture an intensely contradictory and complex process. Cultural studies in other countries like the US, I think, has to fixate on the moment of consumption and the textual cracks that opens up because it is abstracted production as, again, the workings of a general system. Now, let me just repeat that I know there is no single Canadian cultural studies nor a unitary cultural studies in the United States. But I think, as I've said, the common sense understanding of Canadian culture, both from kind of ordinary vernacular versions up through more institutional and scholarly versions, there's the shared sense that the very making and existing of a cultural artifact is not obvious, is not simply the starting point for an analysis, but something itself to be puzzled over and unpacked. Okay, so now let's move to some examples of cultural artifacts and some theoretical notions I find useful in analyzing them. This is a little bit like a medley of a few articles I've either written or want to write, and I apologize if any of you have heard some of this before. Now, like a lot of you, I'm in the midst of trying to write a SSHRC grant proposal, which I think is due next week. And I'm going to write it on the subject of film extras and small part actors in film. Why? Well, partly there's been some bits of interesting work on film extras. There have been artist exhibits in Europe that treat film extras as sort of the very embodiment of the multitude, of the anonymous, mobile, global workforce. Then there's been very interesting work on the history of extras in Hollywood and other large film industries, and very interesting work on the disappearance of extras from contemporary French cinema and how that means a kind of disappearance of social texture in films that are mostly about four middle-class people having dinner together. I'm interested in various moments in which the extra appears. The professionalization of what came to be known as the fancy dress extra in Hollywood in the 1930s, the ways in which post-World War II movements in film, neorealism in Italy, the New Wave in France, had contempt for professional extras, and in their drive to fill their films with real social texture, pushed aside a system of professionalization that had been in existence for decades before. Now, I've written little things on extras in recent years, but there's a Canadian dimension that interests me in particular. As you probably know, as more and more Hollywood films have come to be shot in Canada, their producers are obliged, for contractual or budgetary reasons, to employ Canadian actors in what are usually small roles. And I'm interested, therefore, in the way in which Canadian faces and bodies come to provide the social texture, the background texture of dramas and comedies that mostly feature US-based stars. So I'm going to show you two brief clips, one from the film Chicago, in which two award-winning Canadian actors, Colm Fiore and Sean McCann, hover in the background of the courtroom scene. Both of these, interestingly to me, had played Canadian prime ministers in TV series. They're now reduced to the status of small-part judicial actors in a courtroom scene. In Hairspray, not the John Waters, the remake, Jane Eastwood, a very prominent Canadian actress with a 40-year career, has a few seconds as the teacher who punishes the lead character for her devotion to sinful dance music. Let me just show you these clips together. That's Colm Fiore.
I submit this as Exhibit X. Roxy Hart's diary.
That's Sean McCann.
Even if she did, this
Hairspray. That's Jan Eastwood.
I trust it's something really important. Shut up, then.
Okay, now I want to use that example to spend a little bit of time on a theoretical notion that I found appropriate, not just for studying film extras, but for the broader project of a Canadian cultural studies. This is my first quote. And it's from Franco Moretti, who's the Italian-born literary theorist who now works at Stanford University. Maybe some of you, if you're doing literary studies, know about him. He's best known, and in many cases, mostly appreciated, in some cases despised, for his statistical work on literature. He'll do, for example, large-scale studies where he'll take 300 19th century novels and simply note where their narratives begin and where they end, geographically, within England. He'll study English novels, and there's nothing kind of simpler, but you get, when you look over 300 examples, you get a real sense of what are the typical narrative movements of characters. What place stands in most often for a happy resolution to a character's life? Where typically do they begin? And by sort of doing that kind of analysis, he familiarizes literary works, and also does so by looking at many examples that are outside of the canon. Now, his call for a distant reading, which is distant reading, he calls the process of standing back, looking at large numbers of examples from a distance such that they kind of, it's just that they're kind of sharpest outlines that manifest themselves. And I found over the years, as I was always, when I study music or film, I was interested in just lots of examples of things rather than the in-depth complexity of every one, that I was doing something like that, although he made it kind of respectable. And so I think the idea of a distant reading is one of the things that cultural studies can bring to the study of culture, precisely because it doesn't require or presume the sorts of in-depth sensitivity to textual complexity that you would have to probably demonstrate in an English department. So Moretti, in the case of extras, it would be pointless, I think, to get into the complexities of Hairspray or Chicago as Canadian text. Some have tried to reclaim them as Canadian text, but no, they're not. They're textual spaces through which a lot of Canadian elements are threaded. And the notion of the distant reading, I think, invites us to stand at some remove from the corpus of U.S. films shot in Canada and to map this kind of fleeting presence of Canadian performers across broad numbers of such films. What you get then is a sense of the pattern. Another study I did was, and I'll use an example of that later, was of Quebec-based disco music in the mid-1970s, and simply by drawing almost a map of when records came out and where they had success in the world, you get a kind of schema of the transnational circulation of these things that the study of any one in any depth would not necessarily reveal. Now, when I think about those two examples, other issues or other kind of observations start to occur to me. Canadian actors are hired to play small parts in the backgrounds of American films. What does it mean to be in the background of a film? Much of the time, it means that you're playing the role of a narrative constraint, somebody that the characters have to deal with for a few seconds before they get back to their main ambition of having sex with each other or finding the person they're looking for or getting out of trouble. Small part players much of the time represent the social forces against which lead characters struggle in their quest for triumph, for romantic sexual fulfillment, or for happiness. This is a typical definition of the bit player, the character. What interests me is how this traditional function comes to be mapped onto a transnational relationship. In the case of US films shot in Canada, Canadian bit players are the judges, the lawyers, the police captains, the border guards, the moralistic teachers who provide narrative impediments to libidinous, freedom-seeking US stars. And so an economic legal arrangement that requires that you hire a bunch of Canadian actors or makes it cheaper to do so produces a particular kind of ideological effect. Canadians are the rather faceless bearers of institutional authority, the obstacles to fun and freedom. To borrow a term from Marta Sevignano, a term I've always liked and quoted endlessly, Canadian performers, this isn't her yet, perform a specific function within what she calls a transnational political economy of passion. She talks about how parts of the world come to embody particular levels of emotional intensity. We saw that in the paper on Ugly Betty and so on. Where are you? Okay. Oh, she's gone. Oh, no. Good. Latino music is more sexy than German music. American performers break through constraints more easily than do Canadian ones. So a conventional political economy of Canadian culture can reconstruct the legal financial arrangements that organize the co-presence of American and Canadian performers in this way. But I think a cultural studies of Canadian culture should be attentive to the ways in which the very images of co-presence that we see there, Canadians sort of shuffling around behind American stars, is the image of a transnational arrangement of affect and emotion in which the Canadians almost always stand. And I've gone down IMDb looking at the careers of Canadian actors who have played in American films, and they're like, border guard, policeman, vice principal, and so on. These are the typical sorts of roles. Moretti, I think, authorizes us to pull out these small, fleeting examples, to catalog and categorize them, to study what Orvar Lofgren, the Swedish ethnologist, who I've also quoted hundreds of times, once called the nationalization of trivialities. Now, my second example is even more trivial, but I want to begin with the quote that I hope makes it useful. We often come across articles, or we hope we will in our lives, that seem to all of a sudden point us in a new direction at the same time as they seem to concretize intuitions or inclinations you already had. This article by Gayonkar and Pavanelli, the introduction to a 2003 issue of the journal Public Culture, had this effect on me, and I've been boring my friends and colleagues ever since by asking them to read it. I'm hijacking and diverting it for my own purposes, but in this brief extract from this article, there are three highly productive ideas, I think. One is that of an ethnography of forms, an attentiveness to the social life of cultural forms, not simply of ideas, values, contents, and so on, but of forms. I'll say a little bit more about that when I come to my fourth example. A second, though, is the notion of circulation, which is there somewhere, as they circulate. Circulation had been gathering steam in cultural analysis prior to this article, and it's become even more prominent since, in part because of mobility studies and a number of other streams that are very much interested in patterns of movement. But it's the third idea, that of the edges of form, that most interests me and has been the most challenging and the most generative. In a sense, it combines the other two. The edges of form will be found in an ethnography of forms, and the edges of forms, Gayonkar and Pavanelli say, shape the ways in which a cultural artifact will circulate. Now, what Gayonkar and Pavanelli mean by edges is never entirely clear, but that lack of clarity, I think, invites us to think about it a little more. We can think of form, for example, the way Bakhtin did, as a cultural institution that condenses the social relations of its time. That's a common way of looking at form in, say, literary studies. But Gayonkar and Pavanelli don't want to do this. They don't want to see forms as kind of static embodiments of larger contexts. And the notion that forms have edges is designed to draw our attention to the ways in which forms bump up against each other, participate in assemblages of other forms, both human and non-human. What are edges? Well, edges are not just the outside container elements of cultural expression, like DVD packages or the frames of painting, although they could probably include those. In important ways, edges are the interfaces of cultural artifacts, the points of contact that shape their interaction with other beings and other forms. They are the surfaces which organize a form's mobility. I think of the example of the front page of a tabloid newspaper, say from the 1920s, with its large photographs and its blaring headlines. Well, the front page is kind of the edge, the outer edge of a newspaper. It renders the tabloid newspaper visible on the busy city streets in which it's to be bought or given away. And so it participates in the sequence of public images that are part of an urban landscape. It's of a size that lets you read it on a subway car or bus without having to hold, as with an older newspaper, hold it in front of your neighbors. And so it's part of a system for the organization of mobile human bodies. In this way, we can see the newspaper as having a physicality, a presence, a frontness that inserts it into other systems of forms and so on. I'm going to use edges in an even more metaphorical sense, though, and I'm going to show you a clip from the beginning of a cheap Canadian film from the early 1970s. I would say my scholarly motto is no object too small. Well, this really is getting down there. Funny about that. Stop there because that was what I wanted you to see. The moment at which the film freezes and the title Cage Terror fills the screen. Now, the original title of this film was Golden Apples of the Sun, based on a line in a poem by W.B. Yeats. This suggests, I think, something of the aesthetic ambition that presided over the making of the film. Golden Apples of the Sun was made by filmmakers who, in the late 1960s, left the National Film Board and moved into feature filmmaking. Has anyone seen this film? Okay. It's the story of a couple of hippies from Montreal who go camping in southern Quebec or upstate New York, and they're kidnapped by Vietnam vets from the United States. Now, the film was something of a flop. So the rights were sold to distributors of grindhouse schlock and horror movies in the United States. First, Golden Apples of the Sun was retitled Ever After All, but then it was retitled Cage Terror, and that's how it circulated most widely. It began turning up on cheap VHS tapes in the 1980s under that title. As a reviewer's note, and there's a lot of sort of snarky commentary on the web, the film is hardly horrific. Much of it is taken up by a camping trip, and as one reviewer online said, it's the first film that shows us a camping trip in real time. It's very slow. And the climax, that's supposed to be the sexual assault of the female character by one of the supposedly crazed Vietnam vets, mostly consists of a series of unwanted hugs. Now, the image in which the title freezes on the screen is a legacy of the film's commercial history then, as it passed out of the hands of its original distributors and onto various kinds of schlock merchants who tried to drain a little money out of it in the drive-in and grindhouse markets. Frozen title cards were common on exploitation films of the 1970s because different distributors would retitle them to try and generate interest. For different exploitative purposes. Quentin Tarantino in Death Proof actually uses a frozen title card in kind of homage to that, because you couldn't, in the original film, the credits appear over moving action, but of course they're not going to reshoot that to put Caged Terror over it. Now, I would want to argue that the title is the edge of this film, or that title card in two senses. Like credit sequences, like the title pages of books, like the frames of paintings, the title card is what Gerard Genette would call a paratext. The title card serves to identify the film and is thus in a relationship of meta-commentary to it, and it also involves the intrusion of an extraneous element, which is lettering over the kind of diegetic coherence of the film. But the title is also the mark through which the film circulates, its public edge, if you like. The new title, Caged Terror, reorganizes the film's mobility, making possible its circulation outside the limited audience for pastoral hippie films into the markets for horror and exploitation. In the terms of Giancana and Pavanelli, I'd argue the new title card is one of the things that motivates and orients the film's circulation through global social space. And this question of the edges of form is, I think, central to the analysis of Canadian popular cultural artifacts, or should be, in both a banal and a more complex sense. The history of Canadian periodicals, for example, is marked by an imitative relationship to US or British models on the one hand, and the typically impoverished resources of Canadian producers on the other. And so you get things like this. This is anybody who studies Canadian comic books or pulp magazines from mid-20th century, with their normally diminished production values, their cheaper color quality relative to those from the US, knows this. It's evident as well in the tawdry posters and credit sequences for 1970s Canadian tax shelter films, or the off-center pressings of Canadian pressings of US or British record albums of the 1960s. In a literal sense, these edges of the form betray a complex relationship between Canada and the United States. Now, this leads me to my third case and my third quote. There's actually two quotes, because after I'd settled on the first, which is from the literary theorist Y.G. Dimmock, I received a PDF of an upcoming article by my friend and colleague Darren Werschler, in which he quotes Barbara Goddard, the wonderful theorist of Canadian literature, who, alas, is no longer with us. But let me just leave the Dimmock up there for a second. One of the things I would argue is that if you study things that are not literature, nevertheless, one of the most interesting theoretical domains now is transnational literary studies, where there are lots of models that can be used for the study of other things. These quotes have no direct bearing, once more, on the cases for which I use them, but I take from Dimmock, and it's really just a question of pulling out two ideas and applying them to other things. One is the radius of literary action. That is, the idea that in studying culture, it's useful to map the distances that things travel, and to chart what she calls their receding and unfolding extensions. What are the typical, not just the limits by which to which a Canadian cultural artifact travels, but the degree to which it pulls back, and so on. Where do Canadian cultural artifacts go? What are the near and far points of their traveling? And these questions, I would argue, fall out of the dichotomy between a political economy and a cultural studies. On the one hand, they're part of the commercial history of a Canadian cultural artifact, but they're also central to that artifact's meaning as the marker of a place in this movement, and as the result of the relationships which these movements trace. This is the quote from Barbara Goddard. And, you know, in a sense, she's saying that identity is less significant than relationality, and she's not the first to say that. But I like the emphasis on temporality and the theorization of time in relationship to space that is just glimpsed in that. Because I would argue Canadian culture is always produced, not just... Sorry, let me start again. Canadian culture is always produced in relationship to the temporalities of other places. If we're copying the culture of somewhere else, we're almost always doing it a little after, and that afterness becomes part of the meaning. To bear the weight of government or collective pressures, on the other hand, sometimes means being too early, relative to, say, the popular take-up of certain cultural notions and so on. Now, for 10 years now, I've been plucking away at a book that I'll probably die before I finish, about this man, Stephen G. Clow. Very briefly, Clow was born in Prince Edward Island in the 1870s. Possibly because he was a homosexual, he moved or was sent to New York City in the 1890s. And then in the 1916, he started a magazine called Broadway Brevities, later called the nastiest gossip magazine in the history of the world. I think he may have called it that, but others would have concurred. In 1924, Clow was arrested, charged with having used Broadway Brevities as the basis for a blackmail racket, which it turns out was true. I actually have telegrams where he's blackmailing people by threatening to publish intimate knowledge about them. He was sent to the Atlanta Penitentiary for 2 years. In 1936, his career in New York was in ruins, and Clow moved to Toronto to work with a man named Morris Ruby, who is the uncle of the prominent Toronto lawyer that we're still working today, Clayton Ruby. Morris Ruby, was launching a wide range of sensational magazines in Canada, most of them based on the so-called spicy magazines that had flourished in New York in the early 1930s. Now, I've collected a lot of these magazines, and I've collected both the Canadian versions from the late 30s and some of the American magazines from which they stole materials. Stephen G. Clow, moving from New York to Toronto, apparently brought with him large quantities of this material and the kind of interpersonal connections that would make it possible to get more. Morris Ruby published magazines that very often simply reprinted old things from the 1920s, barely changing their text. The cover illustrations, as you'll see in a second, were often touched up or traced or transformed in some way. Here are quickly 4 examples of this theft or borrowing, and you're going to see the Canadian magazine on the left from the late 30s and the early 30s American original on the right. There's the relaunched Broadway Brevities from Toronto. There's a bad eBay stolen image of an American magazine from which that image is clearly taken. Film Fun was a slightly sleazy pinup magazine of the early 1930s, but that had a fair amount of commentary and coverage of American film stars. Garter Girls was a magazine Ruby started in Toronto, from which that pinup image is clearly taken, Canada's Cutie album. Film Fun again, Canadian Tatler, another of the many, many titles that Ruby started in the effort to kind of generate a publishing house of some significance. To be the most interesting, another image from Film Fun put on the front page of a tabloid newspaper that Ruby began as an illustration of an article about a Canadian girl forced to act as Nazi spy. And so, I mean, there are many things I find interesting about this, just the kind of labor process by which this transformation went on. During this period, though, many of the same illustrations from U.S. magazines were repackaged in Great Britain as well, in magazines that generally had higher production values and more closely resembled their American originals than do these Canadian magazines. Now, in part, I'm simply making the obvious point that we can study a transnational cultural traffic in terms of stealing and remaking. But to me, what's interesting as well is the way in which the distance between New York and Toronto, the US and Canada, manifests itself in this case as a temporal lag of 5 or 6 years, and in a material decay. In each case, the production quality of the Canadian artifact is cheaper, more diminished and degraded than that of the American one. And this is not inevitable. The British magazines that purloined American illustrations were much fancier. The other thing to note, though, is that this relationship is the result of policy shifts at the level of the Canadian government, which in the mid-1930s, in response to complaints about the importation of magazines like Film Fun to Canada, passed a law banning their importation. So the result was that Canadian publishers sprung up to copy them, and so we had our homemade versions of something that the government wanted to keep out, and the recirculation of those materials. Now, these days, we're used to receiving most cultural artifacts from the US or elsewhere almost simultaneously, and the sense of physical decay and temporal lag has largely disappeared. It manifests itself in little ways like the fact that the Netflix catalog in Canada is much smaller, or that we can't watch Comedy Central videos shared on Facebook unless we go through the Canadian rights owner, and so on. This sense of a radius of cultural action is less present, I think, less central to the Canadian experience. My final case study is a piece of music, and my final quote is from Michel Foucault. And the piece of music is one I've written about before in an article on Quebec disco and on the musician Pierre Père Paul, but you can't hear the music in the article, and I came to the Foucault quote after writing it, so I wanted to put them together today. I'm going to play you at least part of a 1981 dance track called World Invaders by the Montreal musician Pierre Père Paul, recording under the name Pluto and the Humanoids. I want you to see all my iTunes playlists also. It won't be much longer. Pardon? I first encountered that piece of music around 2005. It turned up on a CD compilation of supposedly European dance music from the 70s and 80s. The compilation was called Unclassics, and they actually referred to that as music from the wrong place, because it was from Quebec and not from Europe, even though it sounded like what at the time was called Italo disco. And I started sort of unraveling the piece and its history and the musician, and I met and interviewed the musician Pierre Père Paul, who's regarded in some quarters as the first black Quebecois popular music star. I think Oscar Peterson might have had something to say about that, but this is Pierre Père Paul, the one on the left. Pierre Père Paul began his career in the early 1960s as a crooner of sorts, He was known as, this is just another article about him, he was known as the Quebec Johnny Mathis. Clive will get that reference, maybe a few others, early 60s, late 50s, singer, American singer of romantic songs. He subsequently joined a soul rock band called Les Beethoven, one of the so-called yay bands of the mid-60s in Quebec, where he was the only person of color. In the late 60s, he was marketed as the Québécois Michael Jackson. And it's interesting because at that point, all his career opportunities disappeared, and he says he blamed Woodstock because Woodstock sent everyone listening to mostly white music and music by original artists, not those who imitated someone else. And so in the first half of the 70s, he basically toured as a backup musician throughout the United States. But in the mid-1970s, disco music took off in Quebec, and he found himself as a musician and a producer at the center of a booming scene, a scene that brought together black and white performers, English and French-speaking entrepreneurs, audiences for Quebec disco that were both local — Quebec was one of the 3 disco capitals of the Western world at that point — and international, because Quebec disco records sold around the world. This is the cover of the Boule Noire album, which is a major moment in the history of Quebecois disco music, and that's Pierre-Paul there. In 1981, he played the track that I just played for you. Now, the quote that I want to play off which I want to play, that actually comes from almost exactly the same time, 1982, although I'm pretty sure it's a coincidence. This is Michel Foucault arguing for the importance of form in cultural analysis. We readily believe that culture is more attached to its values than its forms, that the latter may easily be modified, abandoned, or taken up again, that only meaning is deeply rooted. This is to misrecognize the extent to which forms, at those moments in which they are unmade or born, have provoked astonishment or hate. In other words, have been political. It is to misrecognize that our ways of seeing, saying, doing, and thinking are just important as that which we see, say, think, or do. The battle of forms in the West has been just as intense, if not more so, than that of ideas and values. And I take this as a kind of slogan for the kind of work I like to do, going back through the ethnography of forms, through a distance reading that pulls back to see forms, and so on. Now, to get back to World Invaders, and I'll close very quickly, all the vocals to World Invaders are processed through a vocoder, an electronic distortion device. And while they're sung in English, they're mostly sort of half intelligible. And these electronically distorted vocals, which we now, of course, get on just about every hit record, were most common in the early 1980s on dance records made on the margins of the Anglo-American musical axis. They were mostly found on disco records made in places like Italy or Quebec. And what interests me is how this use of distorted vocals was at one level a response to the dilemma of musicians working in non-English parts of the world. On the one hand, you can sing in your local language and risk economic and cultural marginalization. On the other hand, you can sing in English, but betray through your accent and your place of origin your impostorship, if you like, vis-a-vis English. In 1981, Pierre Paul was anxious to break out of Quebec, where he thought as a francophone his opportunities were limited. And so he was faced with the impossible choice. To sing in French was to limit your audience. To sing in English was to reveal your limited command of that language. And so, like Italian disco artists of the same period, he turns to distorted vocals as a way of both claiming English, but also, in a sense, confessing the illegitimacy of its use. And the use of science fiction themes in so much Italian and Quebecois disco of the early 80s, turning it into the voice of machines, is partly a way of disguising or justifying an imperfect use of the English language. And I've argued elsewhere that the disco single itself, the 12-inch vinyl single with its extended instrumentals, its effacing of authorial identity, because there's no real cover, there's just a plastic thing with a hole in it, was the perfect cultural form for Pierre-Paul to use at this point in his career. Singles moved easily and cheaply around the world. They were highly mobile forms. Records that were mostly instrumental partly escaped the problem of linguistic identification. And if they had distorted machine-like vocals, that was a further alibi for the misuse, if you like, or the illegitimate use of English. Record sleeves with no cover art and fake names, Pluto and the Humanoids was not his real name, of course, avoided the problem of revealing a racial and geographical identity which might constrain his success. So to study world invaders, I think, is to study a cultural form and the ways in which that form took shape in response to the distinctive dilemmas of place and identity. The record is not a black box produced by economic structures, which are themselves more interesting. But neither, though, is the record itself simply a text that hosts a struggle of interpretations of the sort which has been so long central to the project of cultural studies. Like every other Canadian cultural artifact, that record is a point in a network of transactions. It's the expression of conflicting and often irresolvable pressures and contradictions that come from where it is. So I'll stop now. Thank you. Sorry for going on so long.